My name is Doug Highland from the Brooklyn Climate Response Committee. We're a committee of the town of Brooklyn that was set up as part of the governor's Climate Resilience Partnership Program. But now we have kind of a free rein, and we have a couple main programs. One is similar to what we have here tonight, but with informational presentations. We've had 15 or 16 of these so far, covering a lot of different topics around climate change and what to expect, what to do about it. And then our other major program is a series of well, we call it neighbor home visits. They're really energy coaching. On invitation, we'll go into people's homes and look for ways that they can improve their energy efficiency and try to help them get hooked up with incentives from Efficiency Maine to help lower the cost of those improvements. So that's the Brooklyn Climate Response Committee. Keep an eye out if you want to get our newsletter and learn about future events. You can sign up in the little booklet that's down at the bottom of the stairs. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce Leslie Clark from Down East Audubon Society. She's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. So I usually say good evening, and I guess I should say good afternoon. This is a little bit earlier than we usually start our program, so I hope that people who work are able to watch the Zoom program later rather than take work. So my name is Leslie Clapp. I'm the president of Down East Audubon, and Down East Audubon is an organization in Hancock County, Maine, and we are one of 7 chapters of Maine Audubon. Maine Audubon is our flagship organization down in Falmouth. Has anybody been there down at the Gilson Farm in Falmouth? One. Oh, well, you must go. There's how many acres?
66.
Yeah, that you can explore, and it's on an estuary, and it's really a good place. So anyway, Down East Audubon is one of 7 chapters, and we encompass all of Hancock County. Presently, we have about 500 members, so just over 500. So could I have a show of hands? How many people are members? I think actually quite a few. So great. Thank you for coming out tonight. Awesome. Did you see it on my announcement that I sent out by email? Good, great. Well, that worked. Perfect. So if you are not a member, I can fix that really quickly. We have, well, Maine Audubon prints out these brochures. I'll leave them right up here. And it's important that if you are an out-of-state member, you let Maine Audubon know your seasonal address, so they will put you in our chapter if you live in Hancock County. So I'll put these right up here, and it'd be great if we could possibly get a few new members out of this. That'd be wonderful. 1 or 2, that would be perfect. And we're a fun organization. We do field trips and programs and workshops and send kids to camp and do birdathons and all sorts of things. So if you're a member, you know all that already. So now I'd like to introduce Nick Lund, who is a friend of mine, and I've known Nick, oh God, about 10 years.
It's 5 coming on 6.
Oh. 6 years,
Feels
5 years.
Feels like.
But before that, I knew his dad, who was a trustee at Maine Audubon as well. So he's grown up through the organization. Nick has traveled to our neck of the woods today from Falmouth, and that's where he grew up, I believe.
Yeah, in Cumberland. I grew up in Falmouth, living in Cumberland.
Okay. So Nick is Maine Audubon's advocacy and outreach manager, where he works with the policy team to pass wildlife protective legislation and policy. He's a serious birder and writer about birds, and manages The Birdist, a website about birding. Check that out. Nick is the author of several books, including the ABA, which is American Birding Association Field Guide to the Birds of Maine, and the just hot off the press book for middle graders called Dinosaurs to Chickens: How Evolution Works. Here's the cover. And I don't own it yet, but I did some research on it last night, and it looks like it's a great book. So do check it out, Amazon, or do you think it's being offered at local bookstores yet?
Should be, on some
Oh,
of
good,
them,
good.
only the
So-
good ones.
So, hopefully Blue Hill Books is carrying that. He says, this is a book that I would have devoured as a kid, as it makes critical connections between modern and prehistoric animals. This book helps kids understand how life is connected from across all ages of the Earth's history. It celebrates the work of thousands of scientists working to place together the stories of insects, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Please welcome Nick Lund.
Hey, thank you. What a kind introduction. I'm actually not supposed to talk about my books while I'm doing Maine Audubon stuff, so I'm glad Leslie took the initiative to do that, so
That's
thank you very
crazy.
much, lovely. Leslie Clapp, she won't say it, she is the head of the power, she's a powerhouse, this young lady right here. Down East chapter is our most active chapter, they do the most, they protect tons of birds. Please join them, they do tons of stuff, Blue Hill and on the peninsula. So if you are a member of Maine Audubon and you live, as she said, in the catchment area of Hancock County, you are a member of Down East Audubon. Likewise, if you become a member of Down East Audubon, you're a member of Maine Audubon. So we are related and we're really lucky to have her. And I'm lucky to be here. Thanks so much for having me up. Let me get my slides going here. This is always the trickiest part. I'm gonna hold my breath and make sure that this works. Well, I am Nick Lund. I'm the Advocacy and Outreach Manager. I do a bunch of cool stuff at Maine Audubon. I work on our policy team, going to Augusta and DC to try to encourage policies to protect Maine wildlife. I'm on our communications team. I write a bunch of stuff. And I also get to travel around the state doing presentations like this. This is the most fun part of it by far. So thanks for having me up. I'm sort of contractually obligated to start with a slide like this. Maine Audubon is the oldest and largest wildlife conservation organization in the state of Maine. We've been around since, if you can believe it, 1843, when we were the Portland Society of Natural History. We're an awesome organization. I've worked in a bunch of different environmental organizations, and Maine Audubon is by far the best and my favorite. We got members all over the state. We got volunteers all over the state. We got 7 chapters, including Down East. And 8 wildlife sanctuaries in Maine, mostly centered around the Casco Bay area, but also Borestone Mountain Sanctuary up near Monson, Holden, Fields Pond and Holden, and some others. We do a lot of cool stuff, and Leslie does all the same cool stuff in Hancock County, but we have education programs, so we teach thousands of people about Maine wildlife, kids and adults. We have conservation, so we have scientists on staff who are out there learning about populations of Maine wildlife, figuring out what's going on with them. And then we have our advocacy team that tries to take what we've learned from our scientists and bring it to Augusta, bring it to DC, to try to do good things. And that's what we're doing today. We're going to be talking about wildlife changes from climate change. This is the first time I'll give this specific presentation, all right? So we're going to work together and it'll go great. But if I stumble a little bit, we'll smooth it through. So I want to start off with a couple of things. First of all, how do we know about wildlife? I'm going to focus on birds because birds are what I love the most. Maine Audubon works on more than just birds, but we're sort of famous for bird protection, and we know birds the best for sure. And so I will be talking a lot about birds during this presentation. And how do we know what's going on with birds? Well, you'll see a bunch of maps later on from what we call the Maine Bird Atlas. The Maine Bird Atlas is this gigantic survey of bird life in the state of Maine that happens every couple of decades. So we actually just finished this one. I don't know why it says 2022, it just ended in 2023. Actually, our Bird Atlas, it was the first one done, I'll show you in a little bit, since the early 80s. And what we do is we go all across the state. I'm not sure how easy this map is to see, but we break the state down into tiny squares. And then we get volunteers into those squares during different times of the season to count all the birds they can, with a special focus on breeding birds. We know they're there in the summer. So we have thousands of volunteer hours on this, hundreds of birders out there. Leslie, did you do any atlasing? You did? We roped in every possible person to help us. But what it does is produce these really detailed pictures of where Maine's bird life is, and then we can compare them to earlier surveys like this one here, our previous one in 1978 to 1983. We can compare them over time to show you how birds have moved since then. So, unfortunately, although we have finished the atlas, we have not finished analyzing all the data yet. So in a year or two, we will have incredibly detailed maps of every species and how they've moved since 1983. Don't quite have that yet, but I have a lot of other tools at my disposal, like a tool called eBird. Birders out there probably know eBird. This is where millions of birders around the world keep track of their sightings. It's a great tool because it keeps track of your sightings personally, so I know where I've seen every bird, but it also feeds into this gigantic database of everyone's sightings, so we can track all sightings across the country. So this is sort of a comparison of a couple of those maps. On the left there, that's your left, right? Correct, I mean, usually. This is the 1983 atlas for the northern cardinal. And you can see there, this is hard to see because it was all done in 40 years ago. But the black dots are the presence of that bird breeding, right? So if you can see the black dots, can you see my cursor on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see there are some black dots here along the south coast, up in, I guess that's Bangor, and then sort of up through what would be Augusta, Farmington maybe. But that's all. There were not a lot of cardinals here back then. Here's a map of cardinals right now. You can see that there are a lot more cardinals now. So all these gaps have filled in over time. We have cardinals up in Aroostook County, up far in Washington County. So using some maps, we can see how species have changed over time. Cardinal is one of them. And so I'm going to start here before we get to the climate change by talking about something that Sai and I were talking about a minute ago, which there are actually a lot of factors influencing how birds have changed in Maine over the years. A lot of factors, caused by humans especially. Here's a bird. Everybody know what this is? Kestrel, American kestrel, one of my favorite birds, an absolutely beautiful bird. Unless you're a dragonfly, in which this is the most terrifying sight you could ever see. Kestrels are falcons. They're related to peregrine falcons. They hunt with speed and air acrobatics over midair. So this is a bird in Maine. Talk a little bit more in a second. Anybody know this guy? This is a tree swallow. Good. Feel free to shout it out. This is my favorite point. Tree swallows, another very beautiful bird, the glossy green back. Hard to get a clear picture of this bird because all they do is fly wicked fast and change direction as they catch insects out of midair, right? That's our whole deal. Zip around, pick up insects out of midair. Finally, this bird, this is a bobolink, a very unusual, cool black bird with that yellow cap back there. They're famous for having a crazy flight display and a song. These three birds all have something in common. And that is that they live in grasslands, right? These are grassland birds, each and every one of them. The other thing they have in common is that these birds are all on the decline in Maine. We've had steep declines since the early 80s before. Grassland birds, in fact, are not doing well at all. So there were some studies put out by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Audubon, National Audubon. I should say too, Maine Audubon, independent organization. We are not part of the National Audubon, the National Audubon Society. We do a lot of the same stuff. We work on a lot of the same issues, but we don't take money from them or do the same thing. Very confusing, but that's the truth. So grassland birds, and I steal their graphics sometimes too. That's fine. Grassland birds not doing well, right? So in this big report that they released a couple years ago, they covered lots of different bird types. Grassland birds are among the most in decline in the country, with 720 grassland birds lost since 1970. That is something that is also echoed in Maine here too. So this is a graph which shows the percentage of the state of Maine in farmland since 1850, if you can believe that. You can see back in the 1880s, 1870s, that more than 30% of the entire state of Maine was for agriculture, was farming, which is, every time I think about that number, that's just insane to me. That means from Kittery to Fort Ken, 3 out of every 10 acres of that whole, what is now mostly forest, was farming, grassland for these species. That number, as you can imagine, has decreased, and you can see here, decreased to about 6%, 5%. This is sort of an old slide, but the most recent one I can find. So we've lost a ton of grassland in Maine, and with it, we've lost a lot of that grassland species. But it's not quite as simple as that, right? Because you could also say, in truth, that when what Maine has gained in large part for when a lot of these farms have gone away is forest, right? If they've grown up into forest, then forest birds can now occupy those space. And so although we've lost agricultural land, we've gained forest land. And so maybe it balances out. But it's more complicated than that, of course, because what has happened, about 1 million acres of which of this former agricultural land has not turned into forest, but has turned into developments, housing developments, right? And so what we're not balancing out the biodiversity, we're losing that biodiversity in the form of housing. Housing is something that's needed too. And of course, housing brings its own habitat, right? So again, things are complicated. People come in, they plant whatever plants they want, a lot of times non-native plants, but different types of plants than would grow in a native habitat, which is also good for some species. So here's a species which has shot up in Maine over the past few decades. This species from 1968 to 2014, this used to be a really rare bird in the state of Maine. Now, not so much. I will tell you, it's this right here, believe it or not. Believe it or not, you have cardinals down here in Blue Hill?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? If it were 1970, you would have 0 cardinals. Cardinals have moved in large part due to us planting the type of habitat they like between our houses, right? Cardinals love bushes, right? They love thickets and things. These are things that in large part people bring that they put between their houses. That's why they love our backyard so much. It's because they have great places to hide and have habitat, and also put feeders out for them. So humans have really facilitated the movement of cardinals and eastern bluebirds and certain other species because we've turned parts of Maine into homes for ourselves and brought our own sort of habitat with it. Here is another bird that has moved for different reasons. You don't have to be a birder, I think, to identify this species here. This is a wild turkey, of course. This wild turkey has increased in Maine more than any other species over the past 40 years. Around the turn of the 20th century, there were 0 native wild turkeys in the state of Maine. Extirpated. They are native here. They before humans, they lived here. But around 1900, there were no more because we shot them all, right? Turkeys are delicious to certain people. And before there were hunting seasons, myself included, before there were hunting seasons, people shot them for food all the time. There was no regulation around them, and we shot them so much that they were gone. So this map here on the left, again, this is that 1983 atlas. This is at the very beginning of some restoration programs in the state of Maine. You can see down in York County there, and then around the mid-coast, I guess Belfast area, there are some reintroductions. I hate to tell you, did you know that all the turkeys in Maine are descended from Vermont turkeys right now? Yeah. Kind of hurts, to be honest. It's a proud Maine, it kind of hurts. Turkeys are doing great though, right? You see there, I'm sure, I saw turkeys on the drive up many places just now. Turkeys are doing great. They're meant to be here. And when we change our behavior, right? When we recognize what we're doing to impact the world, overhunting them, when we stop doing that and put hunting seasons on so it's regulated and not overhunted, they come back, right? And let me tell you, that's a theme that can apply to a lot of things. We'll revisit that later. When humans can recognize our impacts and change our impacts, nature can rebound. Here's another example. Again, any wild guesses on this? Here's another bird I saw on the way up. This is flying over the Narrows Bridge there. Pretty cool. Maine is awesome habitat for bald eagles. Awesome habitat, tip to tail. Great habitat for bald eagles. But in the late 60s, surveys showed that there were just 21 pairs of eagles in the entire state, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The reason, of course, famously, DDT. DDT was a popular insecticide that was sprayed willy-nilly in the years after World War II. And had a cruel effects, right? So what it would do, it would bioaccumulate in the bodies of large raptors, especially eagles and ospreys. And it had this effect of making their eggs very brittle. And so they would lay an egg and they would incubate the egg and the egg would crack and break. And so people in the late 60s were seeing all these adult bald eagles, but not seeing any babies anyway. And it's because of this DDT was getting in their bodies. When I started at Maine Audubon, 2019, we were running the 50th anniversary of this bald eagle trip up Merrymeeting Bay, right? And we started that trip in 1969, and the goal was just to see an eagle. Let's just try to see one eagle, and they did. On that first trip, they saw one eagle. When we ran the same trip, when I was there on the 50th anniversary, we saw 49 eagles on that same stretch of river. As of 2018, there are 730 active bald eagle nests in Maine, up from, like I said, 20 just 15 years ago. They're doing great, and it's awesome. Ospreys the same way. Again, when we recognize our behavior, spraying this bad chemical, we stop it, we ban DDT in the late 60s, early 70s, and we put other protections in place, they come back, right? It can happen. Finally, just another impact. This is just one I like. I may be the only one that likes these birds, but these are gulls, right? Famous Maine coast, of course, famous for gulls. These are two of our three most common species. On the left, that's our herring gull. This is probably the most numerous gull in Maine. Good size, light gray back, found inland on the coast everywhere. On the right, that's the great black-backed gull. It's the largest gull species in the entire world. Don't want to mess with them in any circumstances. Rarely found away from the direct coast, right? So this is a bird that's on buoys and wharfs, but not inland at all. You know, people, and I grew up, you know, people think of gulls as pests. They're everywhere. They're like swarming mice. Gulls are actually much more abundant now than they were historically. If you go back and read accounts of early people in Maine, there were not nearly as many gulls. They weren't stealing, you know, ice cream. They didn't have ice cream, but they weren't stealing Pilgrim's ice cream. And today, gulls are some of the fastest declining birds in Maine. Believe it or not. The reason is because we are shutting down their food sources, which mostly is landfills, right? So when I started birding, the best way to see rare gulls, birders are weird, and you want to try to find rare gulls, and you go to landfills. What's the place to do it? Hatch Hill landfill in Augusta, Virginia, where I used to live. If you don't mind eating disgusting garbage, a landfill is a great place to get food, right? And so gulls by the hundreds of thousands would go to landfill. And so humans were just supporting this gigantic inflated population of gulls because we were giving them all this free food. The state of Maine has closed about 400 open pit landfills since the mid-90s, right? And so with that, we're cutting off this artificial food supply for all these gulls, and their populations are dropping. We're not super concerned about it because it's sort of dropping to a more natural, sustainable level, but it is true. So when I do talk about sort of different bird populations, there's lots of reasons that they are changing. But overall, the trend is downward, right? So, you know, I don't want to dwell on these negative things for too much, but birds are not doing well around the country for all kinds of reasons. The Cornell Audubon report that I mentioned earlier found that about 2.9 billion birds have disappeared overall since 1970. That's about 1 in 4 birds around the country. They break it down into smaller categories. You know, birds are not a monolith, but these birds are not doing great. So grassland birds, as I mentioned, down about half in that time. But other birds, migratory birds, these are ones that fly between Maine and the South Caribbean, South America, you name it. Boreal forest birds, aerial insectivores, eastern forest birds, all going down. And all through the combination of what I said earlier: habitat loss, change in land use, development, and climate change. Some birds are gaining, right? Raptors are coming back. We stopped spraying DDT. That has really helped, right? So there are more raptors than there were in 1970. There's been a lot of waterfowl protection since then. We are much better at keeping water clean, regulating hunting, doing other things like that to protect migratory waterfowl. Woodpeckers also. And this one's kind of, you know, thanks to conservation efforts, I was really surprised that we have more woodpeckers now. That could be because we've had more forest out east, different forestry practices, but it's not necessarily every bird on the decline. So the other factor here, of course, involved with how species are changing in Maine is climate change. You know, it's nice talking to the climate response folks because, you know, a lot of this stuff you know, how's it going, but through some of the state resources and there's a million different ways that we've measured a changing climate in the state of Maine. Over the past century, the statewide mean annual temperature is up about 3 degrees. And 8 of the warmest years have all come since 1998, right? So you can see that clear trend there. When we think about how this plays out across Maine, I think maps like this are help illustrate it. When I think of birds in Maine, I divide them into basically 3 groups. One is eastern forest birds, which live in basically sort of the coastal and southern part of Maine. The eastern forest is sort of the deciduous habitat that exists from Maine down through, say, Virginia, right? And I'm overgeneralizing, but that's generally the habitat. Then I think of boreal birds. These are deep forest spruce fir birds that live in the boreal forests, which is generally Bangor, North Washington County. Not exact, but there are different birds up there, right? There are lots of birds that exist above that line and don't exist below that line. Lots of birds that migrate to the boreal forest that don't migrate in the eastern forest. The third group is seabirds, and we'll talk about them later. But what we're seeing very clearly in Maine is that line between the eastern forest and the boreal forest shifting north, right? So that is extremely clear. You can see it here in this in these temperature gradients, where the 1895 to 1930 temperature there on the left, you can just see, use the dark green bar as a measure and see that just moving north. So 1998 to 2022 is the last one. You can just see those moving north, right? So as that moves north, the habitat will move with it and the birds will move with it as well. That really, you know, we'll talk a lot more in depth about it, but that really is what it comes down to when we talk about climate change impacting birds in Maine, is all things being equal, if we're able to protect habitat and things, what is happening is that birds that live in the eastern part will have more room to live in Maine as that habitat moves north. And then boreal birds will move up and eventually out of the state of Maine. That's sort of in summary, but we're seeing this in a number of different ways or ways to measure it. Gardeners may know about these hardiness zones, which are different areas where certain plants thrive. You can see the shift here in hardiness zones in Maine since 1990. We also are gaining precipitation, right? So precipitation in Maine has increased by about 6 inches, believe it or not, since 1895. And you can see again more precipitation down near the coast, a little bit drier inland, but things are shifting up. So we know that lots of species, but certain bird species are shifting along with these temperature changes. Here's one of the poster children. Anybody know this poorly named bird? Here's a hint. It's got one of the worst names of any bird. Red-bellied. Red-bellied, well done. The red-bellied woodpecker, in addition to, so it's famously badly named. There's a bird in the southeast called the red-headed woodpecker. And so you can't call this one a red-headed woodpecker because that one actually has way more red. Back in the days when people used to identify birds by shooting them and looking at them, you would shoot this bird. I wouldn't, but some people could. And you would look between the legs. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a tiny little red belly down there. I've never seen it ever, but that's where this red-bellied woodpecker gets its name. When I started birding in Maine in 2005, red-bellied woodpecker was a big deal. So if you saw a red-bellied woodpecker, even down in Falmouth and Portland where I am, you would like call people, right? It's not that way anymore. Do red-headed woodpeckers or red-bellied in Blue Hill?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you really?
Yeah.
That's crazy. And if you told me that in 2005, I would have not believed.
Yeah.
But so we know that they are rapidly expanding in Maine. Here is a slide showing Christmas bird count. So every December, generally, tons of birders go out and count all the birds they can find. This has been going on since like 1901. So we have all these years of data that compare to. And we see, starting in the early 2000s, a really sharp increase in red-bellied woodpecker populations in Maine. I should say, I don't know what accounts for the spikiness of this. The red line is Maine, the blue line is New Hampshire. I don't know why it's so spiky, but the general trend is up, of course, and I have them in my backyard every day. So people have tested and examined this range expansion and know it's tied to climate change. And the reason it's sort of a poster child for climate change is because of this study connecting into what's called Bergmann's rule. Bergmann's rule is a principle in biology which holds that, in general, if a species lives, the same species is found in southern latitudes and northern latitudes, that the ones up north are bigger on average than the ones in the south, right? So if you have a black bear in Florida and a black bear in Maine, on average, the ones in Maine are bigger than the ones in Florida, right? And that's a climatic connection, right? You need to be bigger in Maine because it's colder. Better to be bigger. You don't need to have as much body mass in Florida because it's not as cold. You don't need it. And so people have applied this and tested this out on red-bellied woodpeckers. What they found was that in 1950, say, that column on the left, where red-bellied woodpeckers lived from Florida all the way to about the mid-Atlantic, the ones in Florida were smaller than the ones in the mid-Atlantic, and the ones in the mid-Atlantic were the biggest, right? Then when they repeated the study again in the 2010s, they found that the population that lived in Maine were the biggest. And crucially, the ones that lived in the mid-Atlantic were smaller, right? So they didn't need to be as big anymore than they used to be because the climate has changed, their bodies didn't need to be that way. So that's sort of a scientific explanation to show some of the range expansion, but you know, a lot of us don't sort of need that. We've seen the species move and we know that it's changing. National Audubon, our partners, did a great report a couple of years ago modeling out different bird habitats in Maine under different climate scenarios. We know that certain species need certain habitats, right? And they're not going to live in places where they don't have that habitat. That's just the way animals work. And so we know that in certain temperature areas or certain conditions of climate, those habitats do or don't exist. So in the future, if we model out where habitats might be, we can map over which species might or might not live in. This is the page for common loon, our beloved common loon. What this shows, there are three maps. On the left is the current range of that species. In the middle is a 1.5 degree increase by 2080 over current conditions, and then a 3 degree warming scenario by 2080 on the right. Red, so the orange means stable, red means a loss of habitat, and green and blue mean improving habitat. So for a lot of these species, you'll see what I talked about before. The habitats are shifting northward, and the birds are going to shift northward with it. So for common loons don't live much farther south. There are a few in Massachusetts, but that's about it. They live all across Maine, but they don't live very further south because it's too warm. The water is just not right for them. And so as we see waters warm, lakes warm in the state of Maine, we're likely to be some of the first to see loons moving out of those lakes. And so by 2080, it's projected that the lakes in Maine, except maybe some Baxter area, are going to be too warm for loons. So we're probably not going to have breeding loons by a 3 degree scenario in 2080. It's important to notice, though, that not every one of these movements is sort of a death sentence for the species. So if you look up the top, you'll see that there's improving habitat for common loons up north. And so there's no reason to suspect that they won't move to better habitat, like all these species move in the ranges. So that this doesn't mean that common loons will go extinct. We may not have them in Maine, but as a population, who knows? What it is a challenge for is for species that live in the tundra right now, right? So species whose habitat has nowhere to go, well, we don't know what's going to happen to them. But it's something to keep in mind. Bobolink. So Maine is part of a sort of a thin band of bobolink habitat that runs across the Great Lakes and things. Under a 1.5 degree scenario of warming, the habitat in Maine is likely to decrease a little bit. In southern Maine, it's probably going to be too warm for them. They're going to lose some large parts of their habitat, sort of the Ohio band area. And then under a 3 degree scenario, Parts of northern Maine may become better for them than the boreal forest that it is now, but many parts of southern Maine, Hancock County, not great. They likely will also shift upwards. It's important to also point out, though, that Maine will become better habitat for some species. So this is the wood thrush, right? Wood thrush right now, a beautiful bird, beautiful songster, relative of our robins. We are sort of on the northern edge right now, southern Maine is, of wood thrush habitat. So you can go to Evergreen Cemetery in Portland and find wood thrush, but not a lot further north. As the eastern forest habitat expands into Maine, wood thrush and associated birds are likely to expand along with it, right? So what we're gonna see in Maine for a lot of this, for the impacts of climate change on land is just a shifting of species, right? We're gonna become more like, say, Massachusetts or New Jersey in terms of what our climate is. And the birds that live there now are gonna move up here. And so certain species, like if I were to predict blue-winged warbler will be moving into Maine pretty soon, hooded warbler perhaps. Certain species that are sort of just top out just south of us now will likely expand into Maine under current scenarios. So we do have a couple areas of special concern. You know, it's difficult to know when we talk about replacing habitat in Maine. We are going to see the Maine that I grew up in, that a lot of us grew up in, shifting in terms of what it is, right? The boreal habitat that, you know, defined the state of Maine in terms of an outdoor place for a long time, is projected to shift under current scenarios. But if we protect our land, we'll still have habitat, just be for different species. So sort of what we think of as ourselves as Mainers may not disappear, but it will shift, right? So if we have tons of forest that's still good for birds, even if it's for different birds, then that's still okay. I would prefer to keep things the way they are. But there are some parts of the state that are gonna leave, right? And that we are really especially concerned about for their impacts. One of those is the boreal forest. So boreal forest, like I said, is that area of sort of deep spruce fir habitat that runs most of northern Maine. And there's a lot of special species that live in Maine. If you went, and this is where I wish it would be nice to have the 1983 bird atlas, because well, I do actually. Some of these species we'll be able to see when the 2024 data comes out, very clear movements north. Boreal chickadee is one of those birds. So in around 2000, you could come up to Acadia National Park and find boreal birds. You could find boreal chickadees. You could go to Washington County and find spruce grouse and gray Canada jay and boreal chickadee and blackback woodpecker. We've already seen that change, right? So this slide from the 1983 atlas, you can see boreal chickadees all basically throughout Hancock County and up into Washington County. I don't know, when's the last time a boreal chickadee was seen in Acadia on the island? Decades, probably, a long time. There are very few records in the past 5 years from Washington County, which some of those areas were a stronghold in boreal habitat up until recently. And we are seeing these birds, you know, shift further north very clearly. But again, it depends on your point of view. So if you look at the National Audubon Society page for boreal chickadee, they list it as a bird of least concern, even though it's shifting, because there's, as it says, wide range and remote forests far north probably help give it a secure future. So when we think about climate change impacting species in Maine, we have to think about the species as a whole, which is changing, but may or not be a sort of extinction level change. And we have to think about Maine, right? When we conceptualize what Maine wildlife is, that's not something that's necessarily going to be the same way all the time. And so we can try to stop that if we can, but really what I'm focused on is making sure the species have the best habitat or the best chance of survival. Blackback woodpecker, beautiful woodpecker with a yellow cap there. Again, this is a bird you can see in the early 80s, was found basically throughout Washington County here and then parts up here. Basically no records in the past 5 years from the coast, maybe one or two, and then whoops, not what I want to do. some in the records further north of Maine. So this is a species, again, as we continue to lose our boreal forest, we will lose them as well. Another, of course, famous denizen of our boreal forests are moose. Moose populations are fluctuating in New England, as I said, I pointed out. There are breeding moose in Connecticut now, which is kind of unbelievable. The climate impact that we're seeing for moose is, I'm sure you've all heard about these stories, is related to ticks, right? There are lots of different types of ticks in Maine. Some focus on particular species. This tick, the winter tick, feeds on moose, right? And they need moose and moose blood to survive the winter. In years past, in colder winters, ticks couldn't survive. They would drop off or die in the cold. But as the winters are warming, ticks are able to survive through the winter when they're not on the moose. And there's a lot more of these winter ticks now than there used to be. Adults have been shown a propensity to sort of survive some of these tick infestations, but calves, baby moose, are not. There are, scientists in Maine are trapping moose with 40,000 ticks on them at a time. Don't Google it.
I don't know how many of you have seen a moose with ticks on it.
Yeah.
But around here, we have shingle houses. You see a moose with ticks, it's always shingle. It's
Yeah.
just the entire thing. And these are big ticks. They're 3/4 of an inch to an inch in diameter.
Don't Google it, because the images are just pretty gross. Trust me. And it's not just gross, but for a baby moose, it's fatal, right? They are feeding off the blood of these animals. And when you have that many ticks on you, you just can't survive. And so this is an article from 2022 where the state and in New England, they're seeing about 90% calf mortality from winter ticks. And this is all due to the ticks being able to survive the cold better than they used to be. We're working on it. Scientists are figuring out that we may sort of try to artificially draw down the moose population a little bit in Maine, so ticks can't survive as well from moose to moose. But we'll see. This is a big question mark. Moose, as we all know, are of course an icon of the state of Maine. Even though we may not lose the forest that's good for them, the habitat, they may be lost for other climate related needs. The other thing, another area of concern is the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf of Maine. Gulf of Maine is warming faster than about 99% of other water bodies around the country, around the world. Gulf of Maine is fairly shallow, but it's kept cold by Greenland current, right? So water melting off of Greenland naturally comes down, and sort of the way ocean currents work, comes down and cycles into the Gulf of Maine and keeps it cold water, and is balanced out by the very warm jet stream current that circulates from the equator up around North Carolina and swings around. So this warm water body and this cold water body sort of meet, off of New England really, and are crucially important to sort of weather patterns, rain patterns around the world. But for the Gulf of Maine, this Greenland current keeps it cold, and cold water is better for fish and a lot of fish stocks that we have here. This is warming very rapidly. I don't know if this slide is easy to read, but what we're seeing is that the Gulf of Maine is warming. I forget mine. Sorry. Anyway, well, you can see the difference in water temperature from the southern Gulf of Maine here off of Cape Cod, and then the northern up here. And over the course from 1901 to 2000, it's increased about 4 degrees so far. And that means a lot for the species that live there for a couple of ways. One, the Gulf is just home to species that typically didn't live here. We are seeing species that are typically thought of as mid-Atlantic species, southern species, moving into the Gulf of Maine. That includes blue crabs. So if you're in the Chesapeake, blue crabs are sort of the lobsters of the Chesapeake. Scientists have found them, fishermen have found them in the Gulf of Maine already. Black sea bass and long-fin squid here. So these are species that didn't used to be found in any numbers in the Gulf, but are now found here more commonly. Other species are moving out, or changing, and unfortunately, I don't know if this is gonna work. I had this little video working, but I couldn't get it to work here. This is a video of,
I think you need to be in presentation mode during editing.
yeah. Well, I'll just talk you through it. This is lobster landings, in the Gulf of Maine and further south. Starting here in 1967. Since then, lobsters, as you would see if this played, a very clear movement of lobsters into the Gulf of Maine. So basically, the lobster populations in the past decade or so have been as high as ever, higher than ever in the Gulf of Maine. That's due to a lot of factors, including, the great job that lobstermen are doing in sort of keeping lobster populations healthy and stable, but also the water quality itself improving over previous years. But it's a very clear northward movement. And so and lots of people are paying attention to how lobsters may move in the Gulf of Maine as it warms. The projection currently is that there's likely to be a bit of a decline from our 30-year highs that we're in now. But we expect it, especially due to conservation practices. There's a lot of us invested in keeping lobster in the Gulf of Maine, that the population will remain stable to about the early 2000s level is what's projected. We'll see if that pans out, and there are a number of things that could happen in the Gulf of Maine to cause more rapid shifts, which we've seen before. Maine for years had a very robust fishery of northern shrimp, they're called. This guy right here, big beautiful shrimp. There were years where it supported a big fishery, but the Gulf of Maine has always been on sort of the southern end of the northern shrimp fishery. Quite simply, over the past decade or 2 decades, northern shrimp have absolutely crashed out of the Gulf of Maine. There is no longer a northern shrimp fishery. And that's due in part to the waters warming. We were already on the southern edge of their habitat, and so as the water has moved, they've just moved further north. But scientists have also shown that it's due to southern species coming in and predating, right? So these long-fin shrimp, the squid that I mentioned earlier, are moving into the Gulf and are voracious predators, and so eat shrimp. And so one study has tied crashing populations of northern shrimp, not just to sort of fishing pressure, but also to predation from species that they didn't have to worry about before. So it's all part of the complicated process here. Overall, I pulled some charts from different folks who've done analysis of what they expect might happen in the Gulf of Maine under various climate scenarios. And so this one here this is sort of on the left, a past, a present as of 2015, and a future scenario in the Gulf. So this covers puffins, right whales, herring, calanus, which are these copepods that everybody feeds on, cod, and lobster. So, and then in 2015, you can see that there are fewer of the copepods. There's now added a squid, there's added a black sea bass, and there's added lobster too. Their projections are in the future that puffins will likely decrease. We'll talk about that in a second. Right whales are likely to move out of the Gulf as the sort of stocks of different copepods are declining. They need food that's more abundant elsewhere. Groundfish like herring will decrease, while squid are likely to increase. More southern species like the bass are likely to come in. Copepods and cod likely decrease, and lobsters likely decrease, although maybe not disappear altogether. Again, these are not my studies, but I'm just passing along what we expect to see in the Gulf. It gets a lot more, there's a lot more analysis to that. This is what an overwhelming graph this is. But basically what I wanted to show here is that, there are different exposure risks and climate risks to different types of species. Some of the species that we expect to have the most impact from a warming Gulf are shallow species. So if you're talking about shellfish, things that live in the mud and shallow water typically that may be affected. So scallops and things like that. Lots of horseshoe crabs, mussels, and then across the move. So this is, I don't want to go into this whole slide, but I just wanted to assure you that there are scientists studying not just sort of the commercially important stocks, but all different marine species in the Gulf. Here's one that I do feel a little more comfortable talking about. one of Maine's most famous species, right? Atlantic puffin. Maine is the only species in the USA that has breeding populations of Atlantic puffins. We're very proud of these birds. We don't have a ton of spots for them, right? So their deal basically is that these birds and some of their relatives in the alcid family, like black guillemots and common murres and razorbills, they spend their entire life on the ocean. So in the winter, they're just bobbing around out there on the seas, right? Just out in the ocean. The one thing they haven't figured out how to do is lay eggs on the ocean, right? So these birds still need to come to some sort of shore to lay their eggs. And Maine, with our remote, rocky, predator-free islands, is perfect for them. So in the summer, all these birds come to these islands, and terns and gulls and other birds, and lay their eggs. And if anyone's been out on a puffin cruise, it's the coolest, because you're out there and it's like a normal day on the water, and then in the distance you see this, all these things flying around, you're like, what is that, mosquitoes? And then you get there and you're in this whirlwind of these birds squawking and flying around. It's a true marvel of nature, I love it. And we're really proud to have puffins. I don't need to go into it, but puffins are a huge success story in Maine. We didn't have any in the 60s and 70s. Again, they were overhunted and their eggs were taken in the predators were put on their islands. Decades ago, that has been solved largely through lots of management from National Audubon and federal and state partners. Puffins are doing great. But we are still very concerned about them and how climate may impact them. So during the summer, when, like any bird species, when puffins have babies, they spend all day trying to feed their babies, right? So they go from their burrows, they nest in burrows underground, and they fly out to find fish, and then they fly back and give the fish to the babies. That's just like any bird in your backyard, a chickadee getting a caterpillar and bringing it back to its nest. Any bird does this. But for centuries, millennia, puffins have found certain fish in the Gulf of Maine that they use to feed their baby. Those fish are leaving and other fish are coming in. And so the question we're watching is, are the new fish that are moving in going to be okay for puffins to feed their babies? It's a big question, and a couple of years ago, there was a big scare about this fish right here. So you see how there's a couple thin fish at the tip of this puffin's bill, and then a big fat one at the close to its inside, see that? That big fat one is called a butterfish. And butterfish didn't used to be found in the Gulf of Maine. But they are on the increase and puffins are catching them. They are much bigger and longer than the typical prey of puffins, which is like sand lance and other sort of small skinny fish. And what scientists were finding was that these butterfish were too big to be eaten by baby puffins. And so there were these burrow cam videos of baby puffins not being able to eat food, not being able to eat these butterfish. And so puffins, and scientists were going later and find dead or starving puffins surrounded by butterfish that they couldn't eat. And so we are very concerned about what this may go. We don't know exactly how the populations of certain bait fish may move in the Gulf, or which ones will be coming up, or what puffins will be able to find. But what they're able to find and whether they're able to feed their babies will depend on their success in the Gulf, I think. So it's a big concern that we're looking out for. I should say though, they've shown resilience thus far. This article is from a couple days ago. Over on Seal Island, we had a record number of breeding puffins this year, right? So they're doing good for now. We'll hope it stays that way for a long time. I want to jump to my last area of concern here, and that's beaches and marshes. So there are certain habitats. So when I think about the boreal habitat and the eastern forest habitat, I think about that shifting northward. There are other types of habitats that may not be able to shift as easily, right? Remember these storms in December, right? Sea level is rising in Maine. Here's that. Generally know that it's going up. Climate change also increases the severity of winter storms, and so that increases erosion. The concern we have about sea level rise and erosion is that humans are not good at letting beaches shift. We've built all of our beautiful houses right on the beach, and we're not just going to let the beach come up and take our house away. People don't want to do that. And so what a lot of people do is armor their beaches. A lot of towns, a lot of homeowners armor their coastlines to protect against the rising waters. And so you can see that here. What that means, and I see this all over the coast, is that, as the sea levels rise and as storms increase, we lose a lot of the sand, but we're not replacing it with other habitats that become new beach areas, right? So you can see in this diagram here, you can see the eroding beach. These folks put a big seawall up. And what that means over time is that the water comes to the seawall and you don't have a beach anymore. This is, when I look ahead to conflicts involving climate change in Maine in the future, this is the one I see the most. I'm the most sort of fearful for, because this is very difficult, because it's very difficult to ask someone to give up your property. Let your house wash away, let the house your grandfather passed down to you wash away. It's very tough to do. At the same time, the public owns the beach. The public has a right to the beach, to use the beach. And what happens when that beach disappears, right? That's a loss to the public. This is more, of course, than just a people problem, but a species problem. Maine Audubon really prides ourselves working on piping plover protection. So on sandy beaches across the southern part of Maine, then we have these beautiful piping plovers, these cool, crazy birds that just decided to nest on the beach. It's a crazy place to nest if you're a bird. You're out in the open, but they're so well camouflaged that you could walk right over top of them and not see them. Can you see this baby on the left? They're incredible birds. And in the early 80s, they were under huge threat. Humans have changed the way beaches are used. We run our dogs on them. In some places they drive cars all over them. And so piping plovers were almost extinct in Maine, almost extinct. We brought them back. We work with towns. People want these birds on the beaches. We work with towns to help identify the nests and keep predators and things away. Take other measures, and people are psyched and the birds are responding. So we have a record number of piping plovers back, over historic times. But what happens when the beach goes away? Right, so if sea level rise continues and we don't provide additional beaches, natural areas for these birds to nest, there will simply not be beaches left for them to go. And that's difficult. That's a difficult future. I anticipate lots of challenges in the future about how that's going to work out. Similar story here for marshes. This is Wells Beach. There's not a lot of places to go, right? People have, built these beautiful homes right on the edge of civilization. If you're on an airplane and you're flying over, a beach is a crazy thing because it's this massive ocean and this massive land, and then it's this tiny strip of nothingness. And we center ourselves on that tiny strip, but it's a nice edge. Marshes, as sea level rise, are already being inundated. If anyone has visited our Scarborough Marsh Sanctuary down in Scarborough, it's the biggest salt marsh in Maine. It's one of my favorite places. We are seeing very clearly the impacts of sea level rise there, including our center being flooded like half the year. And how do we provide areas for marshes to naturally move? It's hard because there's not a lot of room. We filled in basically every spot that's buildable in some of these areas. And so what's going to happen there? That's a big question. Some of this, one species, of course, I talk about human and species impacts. Salt marsh sparrow, a beautiful little bird that is found in Scarborough Marsh and a few other places in Maine, was just put on the Maine Endangered Species Act this past year because of the loss of marsh. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I will say, we're working hard. And I know Brooklyn's working hard. And there are things that we can do, right? I have to be optimistic about this stuff. This problem in its essence is no different than DDT that we're spraying or overhunting or any of the other environmental problems that we have fixed, right? The water is cleaner now, the air is cleaner than it has been. Climate change, we know what's causing it, right? And we know there are steps we can take to change that. We just got to do it. That's the hard part, but we have a lot of people working on it. Maine Audubon is proud to be a part of the Maine Climate Council, which has released roadmaps for the various things we need to do to meet our climate goals. We're making good progress. Here's a snapshot. This is from 2022 of how we're progressing on the climate goals that came out in the 2020 Climate Action Plan. We're making good progress. We're really doing it. And I don't want to go into each and every one. I know this is what the climate response crew does on its own, but keep at it. Because like any environmental issue that we faced, it's just a matter of putting your head down, doing what we know we need to do, and getting it done. So with that, I will leave time for questions. If you happen to shout them out, yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Great talk. And I'm curious about the boreal chickadee, and I appreciate the nuance that we talked about changes in land use history and so forth with craftsman birds. But here we have a case where it's moving north, but the boreal habitat, boreal forest, probably not moving as quickly. Is there a thermal tolerance to the boreal chickadee similar to perhaps what we're seeing with loons? That would be unusual perhaps for forest ground?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we don't necessarily know what makes a boreal chickadee live on MDI and not in Ellsworth or any further south than that, where the habitat essentially is good in theory for them.
Yes.
There's a lot we don't know about birds and what exactly makes the southern, a border of a bird's range be that exact moment piece. We don't really know, but we are seeing it. So we can measure where boreal chickadees are and have been and project out where they're going. And something is, certainly birds can move more quickly and easily than forests, right? And so the actual shift in the boreal habitat will probably follow the species themselves, which look around and say, this doesn't feel right anymore. But exactly what is that? I don't know.
Yeah, so in some cases say that bobolinks, I mean, we can see the regrowth
Sure.
of the forest and their habitat's declining, it's disappearing in many cases.
Yeah.
Whereas it's still a spruce fir forest in many of these areas that are no longer supporting their activities, which is
Right. It likely is linked to the insects that they eat, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these birds all feed on insects, and those also insects in general are much more in tune with the climate conditions and will react to that. And so whatever it may be that is in particular is changing, moving north, the chickadees are following them. But there's more work to do to understand exactly what it is. Yes, sir.
I'm Jim Fisher, I'm a town manager of Deer Isle.
I do.
Appreciate your presentation. I have to think at the municipal level, that's what I'm paid to do. And a lot of what you're talking about is sort of global climate change and global impacts on species migration. What about drilling down a little bit to something where a municipality or a smaller regional group could actually do something directly? And I'm thinking about the changes in local habitat. I know that Audubon was one of the founders of the beginning with habitat mapping system, which I found indispensable in doing comprehensive plans in Little Brooklyn, everywhere. And could you address that issue, kind of local initiatives and ways we could act locally?
Sure. That's a great question. And there is a lot you can do. Sometimes it doesn't mean that you're going to stop climate change, but making your municipalities able to absorb impacts that may occur whether you like it or not will go a long way to seeing how any local community will sort of survive and thrive through impacts. And so it could be looking at beginning with habitat maps to understand how connectivity could occur and allow species migration. It could be looking at coastal habitats and working to understand how that habitat may need to migrate in under certain conditions. Planting those seeds now or working on some of those issues now may really help down the line when they become more pressing, especially from the land use habitat. Another program, so beginning with habitat is these great maps that Maine and Audubon work with the state that shows different types of habitat out there to help town managers and locals plot for land use futures. Another similar thing we do is called our Stream Smart program. Culverts are not good generally, so we have thousands of culverts around the state of Maine. Those are those small metal pipes that allow streams to flow under roads. Those are typically, you can picture them, they're pretty small, right? and are proven inadequate for big rainstorms, the types of storms we expect more and more under climate change conditions. And it has not just infrastructure impacts like blowing out roads, but also don't facilitate the passage of species upriver. And so fixing those culverts with stream smart culverts, which are basically large corrugated half circles that cover a whole stream, allow a lot more water to flow through and allow species to move in and out, is actually a way you can respond and prepare for climate change. It's much better than you can now. And so a lot of it is sort of doing what you're doing, looking at the land use uses, understanding how land use may change, understanding the barriers to facilitate the change in a way that makes sense for residents and for wildlife, and then sticking to your guns and doing what you do. It's very difficult, and I don't envy a lot of local folks who have to work with landowners who don't want to see things change. It's hard. And so, but there are tools out there, and there is science behind the understanding of how things will change. So I think you're on a great track. I don't know if that's super helpful, but you're doing a great job.
Think globally, act locally.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very simple rule. If the culvert washes out, don't put the same size culvert back in.
Yeah. Right, but you know, like anything, yeah. There is more money for it now, you know, it's much more expensive to replace a culvert multiple times than it is to put the good one in. And if you have one that's wide enough to allow large, you know, amounts of water and sticks and stuff to flow through, then you're not replacing it, and everybody wins. And also fish can move upstream, which is good too, so. Those are some ways to help. Yeah.
Really good talk. I loved all the angles that you covered.
Thank you.
I'm interested in, I'm affiliated with the Blue Hill Peninsula Rockweed Forum, and we've been trying to see who does own the intertidal. You said the public owns the beaches, but from high tide to low tide, it's private. And I'm just wondering if there could be a bigger role for land trusts to have easements that would include, you know, monitoring what's going on in the intertidal and preventing some of the change, because so much of it's private land now, where the changes in the marshes and the beaches, the rocky coast. So, so that was just one little angle we've been thinking about, is it's really hard for land trusts to control their intertidal.
Right.
And
that's a really good point
about that.
You know, so Maine has a very restrictive coastal land use history. It dates back to the King of England or something. And basically, unlike, I remember the first time I went to Oregon and I went out on the beach and I parked and just walked down the beach. And I was like, is someone shooting at me? What? There's no one here to stop me from doing this. If I was in Maine, I'd be arrested right now. But out there, the beaches are, and the coastal zone much more than we are here, is open to the public, where you can just walk down. Maine, it's not that way. Maine, the dry part of the beach can be private property. And the three, you know, humans are allowed an easement for fishing, fouling, and navigation. Sometimes as a birder, I think I want to try to trespass on a private beach and say I'm fouling.
You
You what word?
You need a rifle, then you're fouling.
It also says, so I went to University of Maine School of Law, and I talk about this a lot with my professor. He's like, I don't care about this, stop doing. But the law says fouling and then incidents, what is it? Activities incident thereto. So I could say I'm scouting for fouling. Fouling, what it was, you know what fouling is? I mean, it's clubbing eiders, believe it or not. And so there's a period where a lot of seabirds molt their feathers and they can't fly for that brief couple weeks. This is when people would go out and get eiders for their eider down. And so the trick, you needed to trespass because you didn't know what eiders were going to be. You're like, I gotta go club them. They're right down. Anyway, Maine is, sorry for a tangent, Maine is a very restrictive land use. And you're right, the public owns from the low water mark into the water. And the private person can own from the high water, or from the low water mark up, what is it?
Yeah, private is down to the low tide.
Yeah. You know, the real solution is passing laws to change that. You know, we've relied on, which is difficult to do from a takings angle, frankly, but we've relied on judicial decisions to interpret that differently many times and not been successful. And it's very difficult when it comes to protecting beach resources like rockweed, about who owns this and who's allowed where. And so, I think to the extent that you could use easements to do that, I think that's a great.
Just in the short term. yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I think at least in this part of the coast, it's really important that clamming is fishing, and so in the intertidal zone, you don't have a private property right to restrict clamming. You can stop them from parking on your land and walking on the shore.
Right.
But they can approach by boat, for instance,
Yeah.
and clam, and I think the same would be true if you were duck hunting.
Yeah.
You might have some rights because you were fowl.
Yeah, you do, and if you go down to, folks know where Prouts Neck is, it's the super rich part of Scarborough where Roger Goodell lives.
Artist work,
Yeah, you go down there in the winter and there's gunfire nonstop, because it's great duck hunting going up the river there, and so I'm sure Roger Goodell is throwing yellow flags trying to stop them, but nothing they can do. So I think we're, for land trust, working with landowners, there are lots of landowners who are amenable to people using their property or want to protect the rockweed on their property. Like I said, when it comes down to the intertidal zone, they don't have, it's a different set of rights, but to try to work to protect rockweed could work from a land trust perspective. Sorry, not a better answer than that, but I think you're onto something. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So what's being done in Maine on the state level? If anything is being done to change laws, I actually happen to be on a zoning commission, not in Maine, but in Connecticut. And we really rely on statutes at the state level to filter down before we can change local regulations. This kind of follows up on your question of what can we do locally? And I find that we're restricted by what existing regulations mandate and then also what's being done at the state level.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for that hierarchy?
Sure, well, it's generally a good hierarchy, first of all.
Generally.
Not always. One thing that Maine Audubon is working on hard is our smart growth principles at the state level. We need to, there's lots of competing priorities here. We need more housing in a lot of parts of the state. And we want to facilitate that and allow that, but we don't want to do it in a way that increases sprawl or has other environmental damaging standpoints. And so smart growth principles are a way to get at that. And what that means generally is using things like being habitat, using other maps to identify high value areas, intact areas, other areas of importance, and other areas that are better for housing. And then emphasizing ways to build on those areas instead of the good areas. So this is not necessarily a new principle for everyone, but how do we get those principles accepted at the state level, entrenched, used in places like the unorganized LUPC covered areas, which are large areas of the state that are not under municipal control. How do we make sure those are adopted? That when we look at the legislatures coming up is a big priority for us. Because especially this past year, there's a real crush for new housing and people wanting to open the floodgates for that. And we don't want to stop that, but we need to do it in a way that's going to allow other things to remain, environments to remain intact, and good communities to exist too. So that's one. We do a lot of renewable energy consideration. And so we're thinking a lot about, again, conflicting priorities. We have a bad need for more renewable energy for a number of reasons. But we also know that land is used for that. In the state of Maine, we've used about 10,000 acres of land for solar, for example, which on the one hand is great, but on the other hand can contribute to loss of forests and farm fields especially. So how do we balance that? How do we encourage people to build on brownfields, highway medians, things like that, rooftops? How do we discourage them from using high value habitats like high value agricultural fields, forests, which we see a lot. It's typically cheaper right now in a lot of ways to cut a forest and put solar on it than it is to build in other areas. And so how do we make sure that those areas are disincentivized or strongly compensated for? How do we ensure that compensation is correct? Those are policies that we're working out at the state level, but that we hear from municipalities a lot that they are wrestling with. And we've done a lot of work in past years on model ordinance and things that can help with solar developments. But we see that increasing as the need for more renewable energy increases.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
You've raised a couple of questions, that are very interesting. I used to live in a town in western Maine, and we redid one of the few towns that actually had zoning.
Mhm.
And we dealt with some of these questions about trying to prevent sprawl and that sort of thing. There were three specific things we did. Many towns have a road, but you're supposed to have a certain number of feet of road frontage in order to build a house. We left that in place, except we said you can build a house behind a house. So we removed the need for road frontage. So you can.
Great.
And that made a difference. We encourage cluster housing, whereby you build a bunch of houses close to each other, and then you conserve some land that would have been converted to something else. So you take the same number of acres, but you subdivide it into that which has houses on it, and that's which is not a house. The last thing we did, we had a pre-existing apartment-sized ordinance, which said that in order to be an apartment, you had to have a certain number of square feet. We reduced that.
Awesome.
So the smaller places could be, I think we went from 600 square feet to 400 square feet or something, but the concept was to make more places available for that.
Awesome.
It's also interesting that this solar discussion, that under all of those panels, there is in fact habitat.
Sure.
And in habitat benefits a different suite of species.
Yep.
So I object to saying solar panels destroy things. No, they just change things.
Yeah.
It generates a habitat. And I need to tell you that 10,000 acres is a very small number compared to the state of it.
Sure.
You know, it sounds like a big number for those of us that don't deal with a lot of them. If you deal with a moderate amount of land, 10,000 acres is smaller than a drop in the bucket at this point.
Oh, absolutely. And I should, Maine Audubon is strong supporters of solar. We've released a guide for native planting that can go under solar panels to help with that. We sponsor 2 of these agriculture bills. So that is not in any way to knock solar. It's just to recognize that everything is a land use, and that there are considerations for all different kinds of land use.
Right, but if you cut trees to make a solar, it's just you're like, oh my God, there was a forest.
Yeah.
You also produced a lot of different habitat under the solar.
Yeah,
panels.
that's true. The density piece, I think, is crucial. Getting people comfortable with density is a big deal. And it's hard to do, even though density, when people live in dense walkable neighborhoods, they're always happier. It's a better place to live. I mean, not for everybody, that's fine, but like it can make great places to live. I think about my hometown of Falmouth, so right there on Route 1. When I was a kid, there was this big plan in Falmouth about how we're gonna allow Falmouth to develop all these buildings on Route 1. What are we gonna do? What they decided to do is these large commercial lots with like swales and things between them. And it stinks. You drive Falmouth now, and it's just a strip, it's a strip mall with this useless habitat in between. These mowed grass, nothingness, not habitat. No walkability, a pain in the butt, not a good town.
Right.
If they had just taken the leap and accepted the fact that that density is actually a good thing, and said, let's cluster these buildings together instead of putting one building per acre, you'd have a much better town, and you'd have more habitat protected on the outside. But that message, I don't know, it's scary for people. Towns like Falmouth and Cumberland are trying to increase density rules now. People fight them tooth and nail.
Right.
Because they're scared of it, but it works if you can get it. Yeah.
Thank you, it's very interesting, and a lot of it rings true for my experience, it's incredible. Kind of frightening for sure, but I agree there, let's steer what we can steer. And do you remember a book called Noah's Garden? Sarah Stein, it's about mostly planting native species garden so as in urban environments create pathways for species to move.
Yeah.
So to connect green spaces for migrations and whatnot. And I guess my question for Audubon would be, you certainly must look at that in terms of migrations and movement, and at least like if you have to make a choice to make sure they're connected in some way.
Absolutely. So both from a sort of habitat connectivity standpoint, that's very important as we look at things like beginning with habitat maps. on a large scale. But also native species. The best thing you can do for birds is put native species in your backyard. Because those species have the insects that birds need to feed their babies, simple as that. So Maine Audubon has a very strong program called Bringing Nature Home, where we grow and sell native species to folks. You know, most nurseries you go to around the state don't have almost any native species, so very few. And so encouraging them to do more, growing their own and getting them out there is really helpful. Because providing those connections, providing that habitat for species to get where they need to go or have what they need, can go a long way to insulating ourselves from impacts of climate, impacts of development.
I think we should call this to a close and let Nick, thank you very much.